Okay, it's been about 10 months since we've been doing any of these classes, but we're back into the swing of it with 2 classes a day, 5 days a week. And today, at the 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Thursdays, we're going to be continuing the year one backbone course, where we're going through 8 different sections of philosophical fields and cherry picking some essays to get an idea of the general layout of the battleground of these different fields. We did determinism and free will. We did the mind body problem. We did the existence of God. We did a meta ethical question on moral judgments. And now we're in the a priori section, and we left off before we read John Stuart Mill. So, just to remind everybody a bit about what we've been talking about. Um, we've got some things to pay attention to. John Stuart Mill does not like a priori knowledge, or he doesn't like, he thinks everything is inductive, and he's been arguing that case for a while now. And he's going to get into saying, well, but what about things that seem really certain, like geometric or mathematical truths? How come they can be so certain if everything is grounded in a probabilistic, inductive set of ideas? And so we're going to pay attention to these concepts again. So, absolute certainty. If we were absolutely certain of something, if it was a universal truth that we could be absolutely certain of, what if it was an innate truth that we could be absolutely certain of that's also universal? I mean, there's all sorts of different ideas here. The distinctions between a lot of these we got to pay attention to as well. What about necessary propositions, things which would have to be true? Are they really just tautologies? Some thinkers are going to argue. But it seems like a truth that bachelors are unmarried. All bachelors are unmarried men. It's like, well, that seems like a truth and it seems necessary. So what do we do about that? What about the concept of mathematical certainty? And this is all to just give us this notion of the a priori. So we have a few distinctions that are different from the distinction between a priori and a posteriori, and they're going to be important for us to know so we don't confuse them. We talked about the difference between analytic and synthetic. Analytic statements are statements, the truth of which is determined merely by looking at the meaning of the words themselves and nothing else. And synthetic means not analytic. It just means the truth of the statement requires consideration of something other than just the meanings of the words. And that could be the real world, or it could be something else perhaps, but it's not just the meanings of the words in which the truth or falsity of the statement lies. Analytic truths can be talked about apart from how we come to know things. So this is important. So you could say, I come to know what two-ness is and four-ness is through experience. But that doesn't mean that the truth that 2 and 2 make 4 is not analytic, or maybe it does. Mill is going to argue on that topic today. But typically, people who believe in analytic truths and think that there is such a thing are saying this doesn't have anything to do with how you came to know it. It just means the judgment of whether or not it's true is based merely by looking at understanding the definitions of the concepts and the terms used. The truth value of an analytic statement is determined entirely by the meanings of the constituent words. Then we have another idea that can get confused and is related, but not the same thing, which is that all innate ideas would be a priori ideas, but that doesn't mean that a priori ideas are innate ideas. A priori simply means it comes before experience. So, assuming that if penis cannot get knowledge through experience, innate ideas would have to be a priori. However, a priori ideas are not the same as innate ideas. All innate ideas would be a priori, but that's not what a priori means. So the distinction between a priori and a posteriori is just one of those terms that we learn in this backbone year one type material. It's just a term, it's jargon, but all of the philosophers had these concepts. They just didn't use this terminology, and we can see that as we read ancient philosophers. However, a priori just means truths which can be known prior to experience, and a posteriori is truths which derive from experience. The truth value of an empirical statement is partially determined by the way the world actually is. The view of Kant, we said, was that there are analytic and synthetic statements. Analytic statements are statements where we're just looking at the definitions and meanings of the words. Synthetic statements are words that are about something in the world, about something else. But then for Kant, there are 3 categories here. A posteriori knowledge is always synthetic. Things that you can't know unless you investigate the world are by definition things that have something to do with how that world presented itself to you and what data you did collect while investigating it. However, he also says that a priori truths are not merely analytic truths. There are a priori analytic truths, but there are also a priori synthetic truths, which means that you can know something without any experience. Maybe that you exist, maybe that two and two make four, maybe that whatever. But you could also, he says, know something about the world. You could know something about the world without ever experiencing anything in the world. You could know it prior to experience, he says. And we're not going to get into that right now because we read Kant earlier and we're going to be reading Mill today. The view of the logical positivist is that no, every a priori truth is merely analytic and actually probably just a tautology. And the a posteriori truths are the synthetic ones. Those are the ones that maybe they would want to count as actual knowledge. We said that the view of Quine was that all knowledge is synthetic. Is in that group. We talked about Quine's view of things a little bit. And we talked about what we're going to discuss in this section. And these are the essays, so we can just sort of get rid of this now. Okay, so on with Mill. Mill is going to be taking up the other side of that battlefield where he's going to be saying, I'm not so sure about all this. So let's read it. And with Mill, we're going to get very long sentences with lots of parentheticals, comma separated clauses. So we're going to just read it carefully like that. We should be able to follow along if we hold on to the rails. And we're going to be on a roller coaster without a safety harness, but we're going to hold on tightly and we'll make it. If, as laid down in the two preceding chapters, the foundation of all sciences, of all subjects that we study, even deductive or demonstrative sciences, is induction. If every step in the ratiocinations, even of geometry, is an act of induction, and if a train of reasoning is but bringing many inductions to bear upon the same subject of inquiry and drawing a case within one induction by means of another, if all of that's true, wherein lies the peculiar certainty always ascribed to the sciences, which are entirely or almost entirely deductive? He says, now hold on, there are subjects which are basically just full of deductive arguments. They seem very certain. If I'm right in the previous two chapters that everything is grounded in induction, that it's probabilistic, that I've experienced a bunch of apples and I think they're all red, but then I experience more and they're either red or green or whatever. If it's all probabilistic in that way, how can we have subjects like mathematics? They seem to have a level of certainty that's just not fitting in a world where I was correct that everything is grounded in induction. Why are they called the exact sciences? Why are mathematical certainty and the evidence of demonstration common phrases to express the very highest degree of assurance attainable by reason? How do we even have access to using terms like this if I'm right that everything is inductive? Why are mathematics, by almost all philosophers and by some, even those branches of natural philosophy which through the medium of mathematics have been converted into deductive sciences, considered to be independent of the evidence of experience and observation and characterized as systems of necessary truth? He's bringing up all the terms that are relevant to this topic, right? Necessary truths. Why does it seem that mathematics and even some other sciences, perhaps, which through mathematics have been converted to an awful lot of deductive reasoning and consequences of what we know and building off of that, how come those things seem to be systems of necessary truth if what I'm saying is that nothing is like that everything is coming through the senses and it's all probabilistic in a sense? Section 1. That's the question he wants to answer. The alleged necessity of the propositions of geometry is illusory. The answer I conceive to be that this character of necessity ascribed to the truths of mathematics and, even with some reservations to be hereafter made, the peculiar certainty attributed to them is an illusion, in order to sustain which it is necessary to suppose that those truths relate to and express the properties of purely imaginary objects. Okay, your certainty can be your seeming certainty is an illusion, and that can be illustrated when we notice that these topics are about imagined things. They're not even about anything real in the world, he says. It is acknowledged that the conclusions of geometry are deduced, partly at least, from the so-called definitions, and that those definitions are assumed to be correct representations, as far as they go, of the objects with which geometry is conversant. Geometry is talking about circles and squares and lines and points. And when we make conclusions in geometry, those conclusions are partly at least based in the definitions of those terms. And those definitions are assumed to be correct representations of the objects that we're talking about. But maybe that's all wrong. Now, we have pointed out that from a definition as such, no proposition, unless it be one concerning the meaning of a word, can ever follow. You can't go from a definition to some sort of a proposition that could be true or false, he says, unless it just be a proposition about the meaning of a word. And that what apparently follows from a definition follows in reality from an implied assumption that there exists a real thing comfortable, conformable thereto. I got to turn the light on. It's hard to read. Hold on one moment. Pardon. Okay. Oh, I forgot to share the link for people to join, so that's a problem. We'll put it there. Okay, let's go back to this. Here we go. Okay, so you can't get a proposition that could be true or false from just a mere definition. And there's an implied assumption that there actually exists a real thing that conforms to the thing we're talking about. This assumption, in the case of the definitions of geometry, is not strictly true. There exist no real things exactly conformable to the definitions. There exist no points without magnitude, no lines without breadth, nor perfectly straight, no circles with all of their radii exactly equal, nor squares with all their angles perfectly right. It will perhaps be said that the assumption does not extend to the actual, but only to the possible existence of such things. I answer that according to any test we have of possibility, they are not even possible. Okay. He's saying, look, I can show you why you think you're so certain over here. It's all an illusion based on the fact that you thought we were talking about something. I'm going to say you're not really talking about something. You're the objects of geometry are not even possible. Not only that they don't actually exist, they're not even possible by any test of possibility. Okay. Their existence, so far as we can form any judgment, would seem to be inconsistent with the physical condition of our planet, at least, if not of the universe. To get rid of this difficulty and at the same time to save the credit of the supposed system of necessary truth, it is customary to say that the points, lines, circles, and squares, which are the subject of geometry, exist in our conceptions merely and are part of our minds, which minds, by working on their own materials, construct an a priori science, the evidence of which is purely mental and has nothing whatever to do with outward experience. Okay, so we've got this thinker who's clearly in the Fictilian camp of caring about empiricism, of caring about his identity is wrapped up in his ability to model and predict and manipulate and make measurements of a world external to himself. And he's saying, first of all knowledge I have comes through my senses in an inductive way. And also, anything I want to say that's meaningful better be about something like that. And lines and circles and squares and points are not like that. So the whole science of geometry is not really about anything that we could ever experience, which in his mind puts it down a notch. Okay. By howsoever high authorities this doctrine may have been sanctioned, it appears to me. Oh, wait, we said the opposite verse. Oh, hey, I forgot to send you the link to the class, right? We just let me send it to you right now. Are you there? Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, all right. I'm emailing it to you right now. We just got started. Sorry. Thank you. See you soon. Okay, my bad. Okay, we're going to get started. We read this correctly in the pre-show, and then we just misread it. So let's read that sentence correctly now. To get rid of this difficulty and at the same time to save the credit of the supposed system of necessary truth, it is customary to say that points, lines, circles, and squares, which are the subject of geometry, exist in our conceptions merely and are part of our minds, which minds, by working with their own materials, construct an a priori science, the evidence of which is purely mental and has nothing whatever to do with outward experience. He's saying in that other Fictilian camp, there's a whole bunch of thinkers who feel perfectly satisfied with that. They say, hey, I've got a whole a priori science. I got a whole bunch of knowledge. 2 and 3 make 5. The area of a square that is made of the diagonal of another square has exactly twice the area of the first square, or is exactly twice as large as the area of the first square, right? I can know all these things. Oh, here we go. Sorry. So Mill is saying I can know all these geometric truths, and they come from the conceptions I have in my mind of points and lines and squares and circles, and I can know them certainly, and they're a priori science. He says, really? You're satisfied with that? I don't like this idea. I think you're making a mistake. And then he says, by howsoever high authorities this doctrine may have been sanctioned, it appears to me psychologically incorrect. The points, lines, circles, and squares which anyone has in his mind are, I apprehend, simply copies of the points, lines, circles, and squares which he has in his experience. Once again, everything comes inductively through the experience ultimately. Our idea of a point, I apprehend, to be simply our idea of the minimum visible, the smallest portion of surface which we can see. A line, as defined by geometers, is wholly inconceivable. It's even worse than a point. We can reason about a line as if it had no breadth, because we have a power, which is the foundation of all the control we can exercise over the operations of our minds. The power, when a perception is present to our senses or a conception to our intellects, of attending to a part only of that perception or conception instead of the whole. But we cannot really conceive a line without breadth. Mill is denying that even though you can talk about the idea and you can attend to parts of it that make sense and you can look for conclusions that a line would intersect 2 parallel lines at the same angle and all that other stuff, really you don't have an image of a line in your mind. You don't have a conception of a line. If you try to picture a line, it has breadth. Make it thinner. Try thinking about the thinner line. It still has breadth. Make it thinner. That's not a line. What we were talking about with a line is a series of points, all equidistant from 2 specific stationary points, going on forever in 2 different directions with absolutely no breadth. You have that in your mind? I deny you do, he says. Our idea of a point, I apprehend, attending to a part only and not of the whole, but we cannot conceive a line without breadth. We couldn't really wrap our mind around it. We can form no mental picture of such a line. All of the lines which we have in our minds are lines possessing breadth. If anyone doubts this, we may refer him to his own experience. Give it a try. I much question.
Who's the author here?
We're reading Mill. We're reading Mill
Mill?
on the a priori. Yes,
Okay.
I'm so sorry. I should have mentioned that. Right. Okay. So, but we cannot conceive. We don't. If anyone doubts, try it out. I much question if anyone who fancies that he can conceive what is called a mathematical line thinks so from the evidence of his consciousness. I suspect it is rather because he supposes that, unless such a conception were possible, mathematics could not exist as a science, a supposition which there will be no difficulty in showing to be entirely groundless. Don't worry, we can have our math. We can have our math and eat it too. But we have to first recognize that we're not talking about anything in the real world. There are no lines in the real world. There aren't even lines in your head. And you don't have an a priori knowledge as a result because it has to be about something. But that doesn't mean that it's useless. And so the deductive certainty or the seeming deductive certainty of this field of study called mathematics will be shown to be illusory because it's not actually knowledge. It's not actually about something, which is what he's going to say counts. But that doesn't mean it's not useful. So let's continue and see where he goes with this. Since then, neither in nature nor in the human mind do there exist any objects exactly corresponding to the definitions of geometry, while yet that science cannot be supposed to be conversant about non-entities, nothing remains but to consider geometry as conversant with such lines, angles, and figures as really do exist, and the definitions, as they are called, must be regarded as some of our first and most obvious generalizations concerning those natural objects. Here he is. I just spent 2 chapters, he says, proving that all sciences are rested on the foundation of induction, that it's all through experience and probabilistic, and I'm just trying to figure it out. He says, look, my definitions of geometry come from that too. I experience a lot of straight things. I see a line painted on a road. If I zoom in at the ant crawling on it, I see it's got all sorts of bumps and it's not really flat and it has a breadth and it doesn't really go straight because the road curves, and none of that's really a line, but I can generalize out the quality of going that way or going that way, and I can kind of get rid of all the imperfections of it, and I can say that's what I'm talking about, a line. But I never had a line. I just generalized from approximations to get to the idea, he says. Generalizations concerning these natural objects. The correctness of those generalizations as generalizations is without a flaw. It's a good cognitive move, he says. I endorse it. But don't think you're talking about anything in the world. The equality of all the radii of a circle is true of all circles, so far as it is true of any one, but it is not exactly true of any circle. It is only nearly true, so nearly that no error of any importance in practice will be incurred by feigning it to be exactly true. When we have occasion to extend these inductions or their consequences to cases in which the error would be appreciable to lines of perceptible breadth or thickness, parallels which deviate sensibly from equidistance and the like, we correct our conclusions by combining with them a fresh set of propositions relating to the aberration, just as we also take in propositions relating to the physical or chemical properties of the material if those properties happen to introduce any modification into the result, which they easily may, even with respect to figure and magnitude, as in the case, for instance, of expansion by heat. Okay, so we're going to get used to the fact that all of Mill's sentences are 3 paragraphs long, and we'll just be really careful from now on to pay attention to commas and parentheticals. But we see what he's saying. He's saying, look, we can do this generalization and we can get our mathematics and our geometry to work out fine. And if we draw the triangle and we draw the inscribed circle and we're making a picture of the architecture blueprints that we want, and we come across a problem because we're actually using approximations of lines and the pencil line has breadth, then we adjust. And we say, okay, this was always a cartoon version of a line anyway, so just ignore this. Let's draw a different picture that's zoomed in more or something like that. He says we can do that with other sciences too. It's no big deal. But we need to remember that we're always working with approximations and no one's ever experienced a line, and there's really no such thing. All right, so long, however, as there exists no practical necessity for attending to any of the properties of the object except its geometrical properties or to any of the natural irregularities in those, it is convenient to neglect the consideration of the other properties and of the irregularities and to reason as if these do not exist. Okay, so picture a line in your brain. Is it neon yellow? Can you see it because it has breadth? Okay, it's not even a conception of a line. But if you want to talk about lines, think about the closest thing you can think to about a line and then ignore its color and ignore its breadth and ignore whatever else. It was white with a black background in my brain. Well, but it's not really. It doesn't really have those qualities. So because I have the power, Mill says, of attending to certain qualities and not others, I can actually ignore the qualities which don't go along with my definition of the thing, even though I actually can't fully conceptualize the thing itself without those other features. And he says, just do that. That works, and we can continue our math, and we don't have to worry that all of geometry has just collapsed or anything like that. It is convenient to neglect the consideration of those properties and of the irregularities of the reason according. Okay, accordingly, so that was a semicolon. Accordingly, comma, we formally announce in the definitions that we intend to proceed on this plan. But it is an error to suppose, because we resolve to confine our attention to a certain number of the properties of an object, that we therefore conceive or have an idea of the object denuded of its other properties. We are thinking all the time of precisely such objects as we have seen and touched, and with all the properties which naturally belong to them, but for scientific convenience, we feign them to be divested of all properties except those which are material to our purpose and in regard to which we deign to consider them. All right, it's pretty clear what he's saying. There's not much to be confused about, but we could have plenty to quarrel with if we wanted to. And of course, this is, well, we'll talk more about it later. Does anybody want to say anything at this point before we keep reading? So we could go off on a bunch of tangents. We could illustrate how this is the opposite of Plato's attitude towards the same things, and we can talk about the Fictilian psychological camps and all of that. But I think let's just keep reading what Mill has to say about this. So far, it's a system that seems reasonable enough. The peculiar accuracy supposed to be characteristic of the first principles of geometry thus appears to be fictitious. Now, we might want to pause here and see how strong this argument is. Let's actually write it up because it's an interesting argument to think about. Mill is saying the certainty of mathematics is illusory. And he's saying I can prove that, so that's his conclusion. And his premises are it's not, the subject is not really about anything. Has he made any other point here? I don't think so. He's saying psychologically how we can seem to be talking about a thing, but really we just have approximations based on our experience and induction and all of that. But does the conclusion really follow from the premise? I mean, he's saying the certainty is an illusion. You're not the supposed problem is not exactly the certainty, but that you have certain knowledge. And he's really saying the knowledge part is the illusion because it's not really about anything, right? So the seeming certainty of the deductive science, as he's calling it, of mathematics, is that you know something certainly, but it's really, you're not really talking about anything. So how can you really know anything?
Well, doesn't number one there have to be? Is it a number one? The second sentence there is is not about anything in this material world.
Yeah. So Mill thinks that means it's not about anything, right? He's being an empiricist here and saying all knowledge that we can call knowledge has to come to us through our senses. It all has to be synthetic. So yeah, the analytic thinkers want to say the opposite quite straightforwardly, and we've read a few of them. They want to say, I've got an a priori science. I've got a whole bunch of knowledge. I can know that I exist without experiencing anything. I can know that 2 and 3 make 5 without experiencing anything. I can be sure of the truths of these things without investigation. And he says you can't even really think about the things without first experiencing things that are approximations and then generalizing them. Now, some analytic thinkers want to say, I'm not talking about how you come to understand the meaning of two-ness or the meaning of a line. I'm talking about how you evaluate the truth of this statement. A line will intersect 2 parallel lines at the same angle. How do you come to understand the meaning of line doesn't matter. What matters is the truth of that statement figured out just by thinking about the concepts, or is it figured out by examining things in the world? And Mill is trying to attach examination of the world to both sides of what we're doing in the science of mathematics. First, he wants to attach experience with the world to how I make a conception of line or two-ness in the first place. And then he wants to say the subject isn't really about anything if there is nothing that's like that or nothing that could be like that. So he didn't just say there's nothing that's like that. He's saying you can't even imagine something like that. It isn't actually possible for something to be like a line, right? Of course, Plato thinks a line is more real than all of the approximations of lines. But for Mill, he's saying the concept as the definition defines it of a breadthless series of points that go on it forever in both directions that are each of them equidistant from 2 specific stationary points and totally magnitudeless as points is not a thing. You actually can't even have that thing in your brain. You can talk about it because when you try to think about it, you add a few other properties that would make it reelable, and then you just ignore those properties.
I think we do that when it's the concept of time as an endless line from beginning to end, but it's more of a loop or a ribbon. It's endless and infinite. It's only our limited human mind that imposes a linear concept of time, because we know we're not immortal. We're born and then we die, which is our own limit of our time here on Earth. So we can't really conceptualize time as being non-linear. Our brains kind of don't want to think about it like that because it doesn't make any sense to a mortal person. But
Okay, so let's talk about that and restrict ourselves to the scope of line that Mill is thinking is relevant here and say, okay, Dr. Tartaglia, can you conceptualize of 2 points that go forever in both directions opposite to each other?
Yeah,
You can.
sure.
Wouldn't they have to meet at some point if they go on forever?
No, I just define it that way.
Well, that's what Mill's saying. Mill's saying you're defining it that way, and Grace is saying, well, that's true of our linear conception of time as well. You're defining it that way, but if you examine the definition, is it something that you can actually conceptualize? Could you wrap your mind around that notion?
Yeah,
Or let's get rid of the infinity part of it going on forever and just say a line segment that starts here and ends here and would go on forever to make a full line. A line segment has no breadth. Can you picture that in your head?
I can't picture it, but I can conceptualize it.
You can deal with the definition, you can use the definition, you can look at consequences of the parts of the qualities of that concept that match the definition, but can you tell me honestly that you think it's possible for something to be like that?
For something to be like that,
Yeah, could there?
it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Uh, I can come up with one conception of something, and I can come up with another conception, and then I can make some statements about their relations, and the statements would
Yes,
be true.
Mill agrees with
They
that.
might be
Mill
true.
Mill agrees that you can do all of that. And he says, congratulations, hooray, mathematics still exists. We still have geometry for whatever we find out it's worth. Of course, we can do that. But he wants to restrict the use of the word conceptualize to something like be able to picture, imagine, or sort of own inside your head without negating the very definition of it in order to have something to think about. So the line segment in my mind has breadth. I ignore the breadth when I do what you're saying I should do, which is think about the consequences of being a breadthless line. But the concept I have, even though the word refers to a definition, the concept I have, I can't even really hold in my mind. If I wanted to just do a Buddhistic meditative session where I just think about a singular line, I'm never going to get to the point where that thing exists even in my mind. He thinks.
That thing would what?
The definition can exist in my mind, and the name that refers to that definition can exist in my mind, but the thing that actually matches that definition can't even exist in my mind, Mill says. It's like square circle. It's not like unicorn. It's like square circle.
If you conceive it, then it exists in your mind.
Yeah, he okay, great. So maybe you can conceive of it. Mill thinks that he can't, and he assumes that you can't either. He's saying, I tried to think of one. I can talk about it.
But
I
he's
can.
confusing. He's confusing conceptualizing with imagining.
Yeah, he might be. He might be. But if I ask you to talk about, okay, so I'm going to ask you to conceptualize a line, and maybe we'll go and do some geometric ideas, but just put the idea of a line or a line segment in your brain. And I'm going to ask you to talk about what's true of that line. Is it purple?
No, it's got no color. Color is irrelevant to it.
Color is irrelevant to it by definition, but the conception in your mind, is it like neon yellow in a black spatial
No,
background? Like,
my conception just coincides with the definition.
okay. So yes, he thinks he doesn't want to use the word conception for that. He
I
wants to
think
think
of a line
conception.
like a beam of light or energy that isn't confined by physical matter.
Is it yellow?
I think of it like light, like a glowing light.
Does it get thinner as it gets further away from you?
Yes.
Well, it can't, because a line is no breadth. It's as thin next to you as it is far away from you. So
That's why
Mill
I think of
says,
it as light, because light doesn't really have a physical container. It's just
is it a beam of light? Does it disperse as it gets further away and get weaker? Is it a laser beam of light that just stays straight? Is that beam of light?
I think of it a little bit of like, well, the sun isn't like a laser, right?
No.
Gets weaker, and that's why we don't fry when it's hot outside. But a laser beam is more straight, So, and that's also a type of light, so it can be both.
Okay, so a laser beam. Let's just imagine a single ray from the sun or a laser beam. Tartaglia is correct. Dr. Tartaglia is correct, I think, that Mill thinks there has to be some imaginative capacity, quality contained within the idea of conceptualization. That you have to say, I can make a line in my mind and I can play with it and picture it and I have it there. What Dr. Tartaglia says is, no, I have the definition of a line and I can talk about it correctly, and that's my conception of it. And Mill thinks that the word conception shouldn't be used for that. And he doesn't make an argument for it. It's just evident that that's what he thinks. So, we're understanding Mill well enough. So let's continue and see where he goes with this. It is an error to suppose, because we resolve to confine our attention to a certain number of the properties of an object, that we therefore conceive or have an idea of the object denuded of its other properties. We are thinking all the time of precisely such objects as we have seen and touched, and with all of the properties which naturally belong to them. But for scientific convenience, we feign them to be divested of all properties except those which are material to our purpose, and in regard to which we deign to consider them. The peculiar accuracy supposed to be characteristic of the first principles of geometry thus appears to be fictitious. He thinks he's proven his point. Not very satisfying to some of us in this room, perhaps, but that's what he thinks he's done. The assertions on which the reasonings of the science are founded do not. I mean, we want to get into his way of thinking here. We're not trying to mock it or anything. Like, I see he has a point, right? Like, it might be playing pretend to myself and to others to tell you that I have a line in my mind. I can see why his rigorous standards would want him to say, no, I can have a unicorn in my mind. A unicorn doesn't refer to anything in the real world, but I can conceptualize it. There's no part of it I have to ignore and pretend doesn't exist, but I know it's there even in the picture in my mind and in the idea I have of it, as I'm trying to think about what it would look like or what it would be like, right? You're dealing with a line. You're kind of dealing with a square circle in your brain. He's saying like you're not dealing with a unicorn here. You're dealing with something that you have to keep tricking yourself into not noticing, that you're making it have other qualities that are more like something you could experience, because all of the ideas you have come from your experience, he says. They're all grounded or foundationally inductive. right? That's his starting point. And so he's being logically consistent through that. And he's saying, here's my reason for saying that you don't really have even an idea of a line. What you have is a definition, and then you can use the power of attending to certain qualities which match the definition and ignoring the fact that you kind of have to draw the line with a little bit of breath, even to think about it. Even to think about a line, you have to make it not a line. You have to make it violate the definition of a line. But then you can just ignore the part that you know is an error in your conception and just say, okay, well, a real line would also do this, because I can forget about the breadth. The assertions on which the reasonings of the science are founded do not, any more than any other sciences, than in any of the other sciences, exactly correspond with the fact, but we suppose that they do so for the sake of tracing the consequences which follow from the supposition. The opinion of Dugald Stewart respecting the foundations of geometry is, I conceive, substantially correct, that it is built on hypotheses, that it owes to this alone the peculiar certainty supposed to distinguish it, and that in any science whatever, by reasoning from a set of hypotheses, we may obtain a body of conclusions as certain as those of geometry. That is, as strictly in accordance with the hypotheses and as irresistibly compelling assent, on condition that those hypotheses are true. When, therefore, it is affirmed that the conclusions of geometry are necessary truths, the necessity consists in reality only in this, that they correctly follow from the suppositions from which they are deduced. Those suppositions are so far from being necessary that they are not even true. They purposely depart more or less widely from the truth. Again, for him, the truth is something you could touch, taste, feel, see. So it doesn't count as true if it's not connected to a sensory input. The only sense in which necessity can be ascribed to the conclusions of any scientific investigation is that of legitimately following from one assumption which, by the conditions of the inquiry, is not to be questioned. In this relation, of course, the derivative truths of every deductive science must stand to the inductions or assumptions on which the science is founded, and which, whether true or untrue, certain or doubtful in themselves, are always supposed certain for the purposes of the particular science. Okay, here's how he says it's working. The illusion that you have certainty in geometry is that you're starting with axioms. You're starting with definitions, and you're not questioning that. And then you can have certainty in the deductions. Fine. You could even do that in physics or biology, perhaps, maybe in another science where you can get a subfield of that science to be so mathematically calculated that you're just doing deductive work. Fine. But you didn't get there. Remember, his argument is that it's grounded in induction. It's grounded in induction. And so the seeming certainty is an illusion because you're only looking at the part that is deductive
But the only claim that mathematicians make is that the relations are certain, not the
relations.
Take Euclidean geometry. The certainty is in relational statements between lines and triangles and things like that. There's the question of the axioms being certain is another question.
You agree with Mill. Some people think that geometry gives us certain knowledge. And Mill is saying, well, not really. There's assumptions you have to make, and those things are not certain, and they're based in induction. So there is no certain knowledge because everything is grounded in induction. He's not saying let's throw out geometry. He's saying let's celebrate the awesome certainty of geometry within the framework of geometry, but let's not forget that I'm still correct when I say everything ultimately derives from probabilistic data intake from the senses.
the certainty of the steps in geometry don't derive from experience.
No, he agrees with you. So in this,
He's saying everything derives from experience.
the certainty of the deductions does not have to directly derive from experience if you recognize that the grounding of talking about lines and points itself is also still inductive. So he says here, the derivative truths of every deductive science must stand to the inductions or assumptions on which the science is founded, and which, whether true or untrue, certain or doubtful. Oh, okay. So I thought he was saying that the things could be certain, but no, he's just leaving that open here. But whether certain or doubtful in themselves are always supposed certain for the purposes of the particular science. Okay. So I think he would have no problem saying that deductive certainty can exist within the framework of mathematics. And you're saying, well, that's all the mathematicians are claiming. And he's saying, right. So math is fine. I'm not criticizing math. I'm saying my larger philosophical point that everything is grounded in induction is still true, despite the seeming objection of noticing the certainty of the sciences, of certain sciences like geometry. That doesn't pose a problem to my thesis that everything's grounded in induction, because I've shown that that's an illusion, that the certainty of the deductions can still be certain, but it's still within a framework that's grounded in induction. That's all he's claiming. He's not bashing mathematics and saying it's all nonsense. He's just saying the illusion that we have certain knowledge, there are still things to question at the grounding, and we haven't done that yet here. But
well, we do have certain knowledge in math.
Okay.
The hypotenuse is longer than any of its sides.
You can't you? Don't you need to add a qualifier to that?
A right triangle.
Wait, what are you talking about? What right triangle?
The Euclidean right triangle.
But that doesn't exist anywhere in the real world, and it doesn't exist in your mind either. There's no such thing.
No, we can conceive of it, though.
He says you can't, but you might be right, and I think more philosophers would agree with you that you can conceive of a right triangle.
We can conceive of the perfect triangle.
Yeah, but he's saying you can't. I understand that he might be wrong.
Okay, even giving him that the notion of triangle, even giving him that the notion of triangle and the notion of line have to come from experience. Even giving him that. Once we have those notions, the relations when we state a relation between the two, that's knowledge, and it's certain knowledge.
Okay.
Even though,
but it's not.
Sure.
I'm gonna put the mill hat on and try to argue from his perspective here. So I'll let you finish, but I don't think so. Not from his. It's not certain knowledge because you have to add qualifiers. If you're being really honest, you have to answer like, what are you talking about with this right triangle? And you say, well, I'm talking about a definition. Okay, where did you get it? Well, okay, you're granting that I extracted it through generalization of certain properties of things that are not really just purely like that. But then he's saying, I can't even really complete that generalization. I can't really pull out just the qualities of perfect straightness with no breadth. I have to attach back a little bit of breadth, but I just try to ignore it and make it as small as I can think of it as in my mind. So I can't really get perfect right angleness to the triangle either.
Well, do you have the concept of breadth?
Yes.
Do you have the concept of no?
Yes.
What about no breadth?
Yeah, I can't imagine it. It's
You
it's like
don't have
square
to
circle.
imagine it. You don't have to feel it. You don't have to hold both ends. You don't have to
Yeah,
tie it in a ribbon, but you
I
can
think
imagine it.
a great many philosophers clearly would agree with you. I might agree with you also, by the way, but Mill doesn't think so, right? Mill, and in the first year, we're just trying to understand what these different philosophers think. Mill thinks, that's too sloppy. You're not being serious enough. You're not being rigorous enough. The truth is, you don't really have that idea in your head. If I asked you other things about that line or that triangle, you would reveal that you're not adhering to the definition because the definition is incomprehensible. What you do is you attach the other qualities that make it comprehensible and then you ignore them so that you can attend to the parts that actually match the definition in order to get to your certain deductions. He agrees that deductions are certain, but what you should say is not that I know for certain that the hypotenuse of a right triangle is longer than the two shorter legs. What you should instead say is, if there could be such a thing as a right triangle, the hypotenuse would be longer than the other legs. Like you
Well,
have to
that's
add
all
some.
we're saying. It's
Okay,
that's if we had a perfect triangle, that's all we're saying. If
but there's
we
still a
had a
question
perfect
there.
triangle,
Okay, yeah.
but how do these two statements differ? If we had a perfect triangle, the hypotenuse would be longer than either leg.
Uh-huh.
How's that differ from uh, uh, um, uh, in a perfect triangle, the hypotenuse must be greater than the length of any leg.
I think Mill is denying the possibility of a perfect triangle. We're talking about impossibilities now.
Yeah, but if he means there can't be a perfect triangle in this world, in the material world, he's right.
We
But
all agree with that part, but he's actually saying the idea itself isn't really an idea. He is saying that. He's saying you don't really have this idea to deal with. You have a close idea and then you ignore the parts that make it not that idea in order to get your deductions.
well, then
He-
you want to be very careful. You want to be very careful with the word idea
Mhm.
because it's ambiguous and it makes for a great deal of trouble. Uh, 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 Concepts are not ideas.
Okay,
Concepts are
explain that.
concepts are the counterpart of definitions. The
Hmm.
an idea is something else. Uh, an idea is mental. A concept is not.
Okay, you're saying we can refer to the language. We can say by definition the triangle. Yeah. Okay. All right. So
So I
let's
have
agree.
something to add here that
Oh,
might
please do.
give a different
Go
way of
for it.
thinking about this. Have you heard of uh, a fantasia? It's it's a mental thing. It's when your brain doesn't form or use mental images as part of your thinking or imagination.
What's the name of it?
A fantasia,
Fantasia.
it's
No phantasm in the mind.
so some people can't see an apple. Like if I say, can you picture an apple in your mind? Right? Some people with aphantasia they understand what an apple is because they've eaten one, right? So they
Mhm.
know what it's supposed to look like. But in their mind, they might only see like an outline of one drawn like a stick figure, like a 5-year-old might
Or
draw
the
one.
letters or the word apple or the
Right,
memory of the taste, but not exactly
right.
the picture of the
But
thing.
others, like people that don't have aphantasia, that have like a stronger imagination, they can see the apple clearly in their mind as a real apple that they can touch and smell and taste it. And people often
That's
don't
good.
realize they have aphantasia because it's not a disability. It's just like a level of imagination, right? So if Mill had that and didn't know it, because I mean,
I
this is
think he has. I think he has the opposite. I think Mill can think in pictures, but he can't picture a triangle. So that's why he's denying. I think you're right. This is really helpful. So maybe Dr. Tartaglia thinks in words and definitions, and I don't think this is true, but maybe you don't think in pictures ever, so you don't see what the problem is. But Mill says, I think in pictures. I have concepts as, not just this is what the words say the thing is supposed to be that refers to something, and here's the consequences implied within it. I actually picture the line. That's what I mean by I have a conception of it. And that's why you said he's confusing conceptualization with imagination, or he's saying I can't honestly picture the line because
right.
nobody can.
But his assumption is that because he can't picture the line, is that nobody else can, and that might not be true. We didn't know what
If he had
aphantasia was until a couple years ago.
if he had aphantasia, he wouldn't care about picturing the line because that wouldn't be a part of his cognitive reality. He has, he's saying, he's saying you all have aphantasia when it comes to lines. He's saying
Huh.
you can picture all sorts of things and that matters to your conceptualization, which Tartaglia is saying, why would that matter? I can have the definition and the counterpart of the definition in my mind is the conceptualization. Why are you bringing in all this picturing stuff into it? Well, Mill must be able to picture ideas. And he says, I thought about what I thought was my picture of a line, and I realized it wasn't actually matching the definition. So I can't picture the line, but I can picture other things. I want to picture the line. I'm coming close to picturing the line, but I can't. And so I'm admitting that I don't have a conceptualization of it. And Tartaglia is saying, why would you need to picture it to have a conceptualization of it? So that's really helpful. I like the aphantasia is an interesting word to. I've learned a lot of words from you over the last few weeks. Aphantasia is a really interesting word, and it is helpful to illuminate what's going on here because Mill must not have it, and that's why he thinks it's so important to picture things to say that you've got an idea of them. And he says, "But I really thought about my picture of a line, and I realized no matter how hard I try, it still has breadth. It even has color." I mean, it's distinct from the picture of the color of the background. That's not the line. Otherwise, I can't conceptualize it. Even if it's black and white, I'm picturing a line and it's got breadth and it has a color. And those are not parts of the definition of a line. So apparently, I can't have the idea of a line in my mind without first distorting it in a way that ruins its definition. So
But we
therefore,
understand the concept of a line as the horizon. When we look out at the ocean, we see the line where the sky meets the water and or
right.
the land. So he must understand lines in that kind of a way.
Yeah, in that sense, he's not talking about it. He's talking about a line in a geometrical sense. That's the only sense in which he's trying to talk about it. So I've got 2 points.
I have a question about that disease you're talking about. What?
It's not a disease. It's just a way people picture. You know, like some people
Yeah,
are
it,
book learners, or visual learners, or auditory learners.
yeah.
Some people just have a stronger imagination. So when they picture something, it's either like more kind of an abstract cartoonish or like a very rudimentary drawing in their mind, or it's so clear they can like actually taste it or feel it. A lot of authors, when we get into like describing a scene, we're supposed to use all five of your senses. Um, and we can picture it in our minds like a movie, right? And then other writers don't have that, and they really struggle with description and setting and world building because they can't see it like a picture in their mind.
I see. But if we're talking about, say, a square, a square in some park, it's got a lot of detail. And if for example, if I say Think of Washington Square Park in New York City. Well, you should get normally you get most people get a rich picture with trees and the famous arch there and the circle and the fountain. It's complex. If you say in a math class, think of a square, then you get a picture that's devoid of detail. You just get a figure with four lines. So
it's like the difference between seeing a square in like 1 dimension or 3 dimensions or 5 dimensions. We can't conceptualize much beyond that. Like, and it's the same way of saying a triangle. Like, if you see a triangle at a certain angle, you're going to see it as flat, but then if you turn it, you see that it's actually like more like a diamond.
It exists in a plane.
Right.
So yeah,
so
you're not looking at that plane.
It depends on the angle at which you're looking at something as well, I think. And
yeah, but this again, this person who has this different capacity of visualizing things. What disadvantage does such a person have in life and in learning?
I don't think it's necessarily a disadvantage. It's just
or advantage. What does it? Does a person like that learn physics faster, or does that person not appreciate art as much? Do you know the answers to those questions?
It's just some people have a stronger imagination abilities. So some people have like black and white TVs in their brains. Other people have full color TVs. It's sort of like that. And then some people have the 3D experience.
I see.
Maybe some people have the hyperlexic or just the
right.
lexic and like no pictures at all but words.
So like people with aphantasia, it's like your mind not having a TV because it wouldn't ever be turned on. Your mind's eye doesn't work like that, so your imagination works in other ways.
I see. That's interesting.
It is. It's more interesting than Mill's arguments here, I have to say. That would be a more fun conversation.
I just kind of thought it would be an interesting concept to talk about.
I remember in one of Peterson's lectures, he asked his audience, raise your hand if you think in pictures, raise your hand if you think in words, and raise your hand if you think in both. And he just sort of took a survey of a few thousand people. And I don't remember what the
it's pretty uncommon, actually. Experts estimate only like maybe 2 to 4% of people have it. So
aphantasia.
Yeah, so it's kind of a new thing that people didn't even realize until recently. Like, I never heard anybody talk about it until like maybe 2 years ago. It was
some NPCs are just robotic, and they only have to deal with. They're like LLMs.
It was one of those things that an author. It was a conversation.
But I wonder about how do they dream? Do they dream in text?
I don't really know because I'm not one of
How do they experience the world? Like, do they see the color of the apple when they're looking at it?
No, they wouldn't. They would only see like a vague outline.
No. When they're looking at an actual apple.
Oh no, they would know, but they have trouble picturing it in their mind if it wasn't like right in front of them.
Okay, yeah, I can get that, but if I if I look at an apple and I experience the redness of the apple, I should be able to have that experience when I'm sleeping.
Okay, so another way to look at it is some people with aphantasia may not realize that most people can see images they generate in their minds. So like when you read a book, most people when they read a book, they can picture the scene. They're kind of like more immersed in the world. Somebody with aphantasia would just be reading the words. They wouldn't actually be able to picture it.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if they dream in pictures, and if they don't, I really actually wonder what an apple looks like to them when they're looking at an actual apple, because I know this is weird, but there's nothing red about an apple. You actually have to generate the redness experience in your brain, and it's triggered by the wavelengths that you're looking at, but there's no redness out there. So,
Well, there's no redness. There's texture out there,
mhm.
which the light rays hit and bounce off of, and because of that texture, the vibrations are different.
Right.
But there's nothing red about those vibrations.
One of the things that people say about it is there's like degrees of aphantasia. So some people have total aphantasia where they never experience mental images. I can't wrap my brain around that at all. But others only have it when they try to form mental images. So they'll experience like a brief flash of an image and then it just disappears. Other people only see mental images if they open their eyes. They can't see an image if their eyes are closed.
Very interesting.
Well, here's an interesting personal item. My granddaughter, she's got some sort of dyslexia, but that's there are many forms of dyslexia. But her father asked her to read aloud a passage from a book, and it was a sentence. It was a sentence about a cottage, and she was reading along, and she read. She was reading, and she said, and the young girl left the riverside and went back to her little cozy hut. But the text actually read, she went back to her cottage.
Hmm.
Oh, I see what her brain did. Her brain
so my son said, do it again, read it again, because he was looking at the page too, and she said, and the girl left the riverside and went back to her cozy little hut, and my son started getting concerned, and he said, well, instead of reading it, what's the last word in that sentence, or what's the last expression in that sentence? And she said, she looked at it and she said, cozy little house, a cozy little hut. So
yeah, that's very
really
common for kids that have dyslexia. They know that their brain can't say the word cottage. So your mind will replace the word with an easier word for them to understand that essentially means the same thing.
Well, is it because I don't think it's that she couldn't handle the word cottage. It seems to me that what she was doing is she she's looking at the word cottage and she knows its definition.
Right.
And she sees the definition of the word there and reads the definition, which is astounding. It's almost unbelievable.
Yeah, it's your brain will make, if you have some kind of
Interesting.
issue like your brain injury,
Yeah.
your brain will find an alternative path to working around that brain injury. And not that dyslexia is a brain injury, but your brain has a way of like finding a different way to solve a problem, right? So it sounds like that's kind of what happened there.
But it's interesting. The problem was just reading the word.
And when she read the last word without the sentence, did she say cottage or did she keep repeating cozy hut?
She never though looking at the word cottage, she never read the word cottage aloud.
Uh-huh.
It was always
I think Grace might be onto something. I think that sometimes people with dyslexia try to figure out, sort of guessing at what the word is without actually doing the reading of it, because maybe she's looking at she knows what word should be there based on the context of the story, perhaps. And and that's
a lot of
I don't know
how kids learn words is through context. They may not be able to understand like the big fancy word, but they can understand the concept of it. So in her mind, a cottage is a cozy hut.
Yeah,
cozy house.
Yeah,
that
is the concept. Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah,
you could be onto something there, and that is really interesting.
Yeah, it's why little kids come up with creative phrases for complicated words they can't say.
Well, what's interesting about it is that there's nothing wrong with it cognitively. I mean, there's nothing tree-like about the word tree. So if you can replace it with arbol or tall vegetation or something else that applies to the concept just as equally, then your brain is working quite well, I would say.
Well, it reminds me of Chinese characters. You have a certain Chinese character, and someone from Hong Kong, someone from Canton will read it with one word, and someone from the capital would read it completely differently. Yet they both have the concept.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks like my granddaughter let me finish with the Chinese. So if the Chinese look at if a Chinese is reading, he could look at the character, grasp the concept without uttering anything in Cantonese or Beijingese
Right.
and just grasp the concept and then go to the next concept and then go to the next concept. So one could read conceptually that way, it seems.
Mm.
Right. Like little kids, especially little kids, they come up with funny ways to describe things because they don't really understand what a word means.
Yeah.
So like a little kid, like a 3 or 4-year-old might call a cemetery like a person garden. They don't understand what's really happening there, but they understand that you put people in the ground. Right? So they might call it a person garden.
Yeah.
Which is cute and funny, but you know, that's just how kids view the world.
It's interesting.
That reminds me of my son when he was very small, called roast beef, roast beast.
Oh, that's cute.
It's a good name for it.
Yeah, I've heard.
And
Yeah.
he was thinking, right? It was. I
Right,
thought
like-
that was nice.
I know a little kid once that he couldn't say escalator. He didn't understand, like he couldn't say it. He didn't really understand that was the word and that's what it meant. So
Yeah.
he called them robot stairs.
Yeah,
Cool.
that
Yeah, it works.
That's a better name, actually.
So I know you've studied Chinese characters before. I got two quick questions for you, if you don't mind. Is there an element of translation that does go on? Like, first of all, is there a set of Asian characters which work equally well for two different sets of verbal language? Like, could you just write the same sentence and then read it in Cantonese or
Yeah,
Mandarin? Is that a thing?
I was in this Chinese restaurant in Chinatown, and in came a Japanese couple, and the couple wanted to order something, but they only knew the Japanese name for the dish, not the Chinese name. So they asked for she asked for a pad, and she wrote down the character, which she would read a certain way, the Japanese way, but she showed it to the waiter, and he understood right away and pronounced it and read it in the Chinese way. So yes, well, it's exactly like Roman, like Arabic numerals. I say one. Say I want 5. And the waiter doesn't understand me, so I write down the neutral symbol, the Arabic symbol, and he reads it. If I'm in Italy, cinque, 5 cinque, but it's the common. It's the same character.
I've never thought about that. It's so obvious that that's a character with many different pronunciations in many different languages.
Many different words,
verbally, but it's the same concept and it's the same character in all those different languages. So I wonder if there's an element of translation that goes into reading aloud something in what's the word for a non-phonetic alphabet like that? Pictographic.
What? Yeah.
What's the word for a language?
Pictographic, like hieroglyphs or emojis is considered a.
No, I know that, like Chinese
graphic only to a certain extent.
Right.
Then it goes. Then it no longer is.
It's
The
an
bulk of the
abstraction.
vocabulary is not.
Okay, but what are those languages called then? That's what I'm asking.
I think character.
Characters. Okay, character. I forgot. Okay, yeah. All right. Anyway, you guys are so much more interesting than the essay of Mill that we have to get through.
But isn't it great? Isn't it great talking about
Yeah, it is.
things that have content and
I'm picking on Mill so much.
you can learn something so fast and grasp it easily. Uh, uh, Philosophy is just too damn hard.
It's more fun. We're having more fun talking about this. You guys are making me want to go do like hours of research in multiple different domains now.
So real quick, I found a couple of graphics that explain visually what the difference of
Good. Can
aphantasia
you
is.
share? Are they on your screen right now? Because if you go to share screen at the bottom, you might be able to show us what you're looking at.
Share screen, the present button.
Yeah, the present button, and then it'll say share screen, and then you can pick the tab or the window or
Okay.
the screen.
Oh well, I closed it. I did send you the images in
You emailed me?
email, so you can grab them and share them if you want, real quick.
Sure, I can do that.
I know we kind of moved on from that conversation, but I found some graphics that'll help kind of explain it, like in a visual way.
Okay, one moment. We'll get
I
that
just
right
Googled
now.
real quick. So there's two of them in the. I put them in the Plato Reading Ion.
Okay, I got you. Pulling them up right now. Oh, come on, just open it, you dummy thing. All right, 1 second.
This has been a really fun, interesting conversation, though.
Yeah, it is very interesting. All right, so we'll pull this up over here and we'll share it right here. Stop screen, send, share screen, window. Okay. So, aphantasia test. Close your eyes and picture an apple in your mind. What do you see?
So like an author that's really good at like describing things is going to see an apple like number one, and they're going to be really good at making the world that they create very visually real to a reader. But if you only see like number four, maybe it's not going to be very clear in your mind. So it's also not going to be very clear in like the reader's mind. That's the difference. It's a spectrum. Other people, when they think about an apple, they might actually see a visual picture of an apple, or they might see all the words that describe an apple. So they know what an apple is, but they can't see the picture of it.
I understand. That's really interesting.
But notice how much more information is given in the last picture there.
I don't know. The one with the picture or the one with all the words?
With the two heads.
Yeah, the
I
one with
know.
the words.
But you're saying that the one with the words is giving more information?
No, look at the two heads again.
Okay, I'm trying to
facing each other.
Trying to pull it up. There we go. There it is. Okay, which one has more information in your view?
You see, the one that conceptualizes the apple has a great deal of information about it. The one who's picturing it has the information of shape and color and texture only.
Right.
I disagree with. Okay, go ahead.
So that's the difference between like when you're reading a book, somebody with aphantasia is only going to see the words on the page. Somebody that doesn't have aphantasia is going to be able to picture.
Yeah, and react emotionally.
Right. So it's like if they're reading about an epic battle scene at the end of a book, at the climactic ending, they're going to actually see the battle in their mind.
Yeah.
Whereas somebody with aphantasia is only going to be reading the words describing the battle.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
So one is conceptual and the other is more imaginative, right?
Well,
Right.
Mill would call this conceptual.
No.
I would have thought of this as conceptual, and Mill would have thought of this as conceptual. Uh, you want to use this as conceptual.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Um, these, yeah, these arbitrary signs of words pointing at things when you're just directly sensually experiencing what those words are referring to, this seems less conceptual to me. This is lexicographical. The concept
It's
is
not graphic at all.
it's lexicographical. I'm saying
Okay.
it's
But
one.
it can be richer, you see, because
Can it?
it can speak to the pits inside the apple and the color of the flesh of the apple, which
It's just it's once removed. I mean, it's giving me the name of the color of the apple, not the direct experience of the color of the apple.
right, but it's giving you more about the internal part that you can't see.
It depends on what you think seeing an apple does in your mind. Your hand gets ready to grip it. Your salivatory glands move. I mean, I don't know. This seems to me way more conceptual than this, but I think that's just a prejudice on my part. I have absolutely no argument. I just think it's interesting to see the differences
It's
in
an
our
interesting
prejudices.
discussion, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is.
Well,
We're gonna
the red apple there would be of less interest to a biologist who's cataloging seed shapes.
he would be conceptualizing the seed shape. He'd be looking at the shape of it. I mean, he's paid attention to that. I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah.
I think of the large language model robot type NPCs as living in the left hand side of that with all the words, and they're supposed to be attached and grouped together, but what the words mean, it's not clear that you know that. Um,
Well,
because what
I find it interesting that in German, the word for hospital is sick house.
sick house?
They got it perfect. Sick house.
I want to go to the health house. All right, so we are doing a recording here for the year one material to try to get through these silly little essays. I think that what we're going to do is there's 5 more sections. We'll just read one more section and we'll turn this into a 2 video thing so that we don't have to read the rest of Mill today. But we're getting back into our conversation on a priori. So let's just wrap up one little section here and then we'll call it quits. So his next point is the axioms are experimental truths. What is the ground of our belief in axioms? What is the evidence on which they rest? I answer, they are experimental truths, generalizations from observation. The proposition 2 straight lines cannot enclose a space, or in other words, 2 straight lines which have once met do not ever meet again, but continue to diverge, is an induction from the evidence of our senses. You want to argue? Because obviously not everybody thinks that, right? This opinion runs counter to a scientific prejudice of long standing and great strength, and there is probably no proposition enunciated in this work for which a more unfavorable reception is to be expected. It is, however, no new opinion, and even if it were so, would be entitled to be judged not by its novelty, but by the strength of the arguments by which it can be supported. I consider it very fortunate that so eminent a champion of the contrary opinion as Dr. Whewell has found occasion for a most elaborate treatment of the whole theory of axioms in attempting to construct the philosophy of the mathematical and physical sciences on the basis of the doctrine against which I now contend. However, whoever is anxious that a discussion should go on to the bottom of the subject must rejoice to see the opposite side of the question worthily represented. If what is said by Dr. Whewell is in support of an opinion which he has made the foundation of a systematic work can be shown not to be conclusive, enough will have been done without going elsewhere in quest of stronger arguments and a more powerful adversary. Okay, so he's given himself a low bar, maybe, but all right. So he's saying, look, you know that two lines don't enclose a space. Dr. Well will tell us how we know that, but I'm going to say he's wrong. I'm going to say we know it through experiment.
That what two?
Two lines do not enclose a space.
Oh, okay.
It is not necessary to show that the truths which we call axioms are originally suggested by observation, and that we should never have known that two straight lines cannot enclose a space if we had never seen a straight line, thus much being admitted by Dr. Well and by all in recent times who have taken the view of his view of this subject. But they contend that it is not experience which proves the axiom, but that its truth is received a priori by the constitution of the mind itself from the first moment when the meaning of the proposition is apprehended, and without any necessity for verifying it by repeated trials, as is requisite in the case of truths really ascertained by observation. They cannot, however, but allow that the truth of the axiom, two straight lines cannot enclose a space, even if evident independently of experience, is also evident from experience. Whether the axiom needs confirmation or not, it receives confirmation in almost every instance of our lives, since we cannot look at any two straight lines which intersect one another without seeing that from that point they continue to diverge more and more away from one another. Experimental proof crowds in upon us in an endless profusion, and without one instance in which there can be even a suspicion of an exception to the rule, that we should soon have stronger ground for believing the axiom, even as an experimental truth, than we have for almost any of the general truths which we confessedly learn from the evidence of our senses. Independently of an a priori evidence, we should certainly believe it with an intensity of conviction far greater than we accord to any ordinary physical truth, and this, too, at a time of life much earlier than that from which we date almost any part of our acquired knowledge, and much too early to admit of our retaining any recollection of the history of our intellectual operations of that period. Where, then, is the necessity for assuming that our recognition of these truths has a sufficient origin from the rest of our knowledge, when its existence is perfectly accounted for by supposing its origin to be the same? When the causes which produce belief in all other instances exist in this instance, and in the degree of strength as much superior to that which exists in the cases of the intensity of the belief itself is superior, the burden of proof lies on the advocates of the contrary opinion. It is for them to point out some fact inconsistent with the supposition that this part of our knowledge of nature is derived from the same sources as every other part. What is he saying? He's saying everything is experiential, everything is experimental, everything is grounded in induction from the senses. And what he's saying is that you have endless experimental data, even from the time that you are very young, telling you that lines which cross each other move away from each other afterwards. If you are surrounded by experiment after experiment after experiment, which proves that when you're not even looking into the matter, why should you think that you just have it as a priori knowledge? I mean, we get knowledge through going and investigating things, and I can, take a chicken egg and a thing, and I can see and I can gather some data and I can make a conclusion. That is how I get knowledge usually. But from the time that I'm very young, I'm noticing that the further I go along a line, the more I get away from another line that was going in a different direction. And I see it all over the place. So why should I posit that I have that knowledge a priori when I've a more than sufficient amount, a plethora of evidence has already been given to me for that exact knowledge? This, for instance, they would be able to do if they could prove chronologically that we had the conviction, at least partially, in so early in infancy as to be anterior to those impressions of the senses, on the senses upon which, on the other theory, the conviction is founded. This, however, cannot be proven, the point being too far back within the reach of memory and too obscure for external observation. So they're positing that we were just sort of maybe born with this knowledge, or that our brains, as they're developing, just have to have this idea of lines. But they're just positing it. They can't really go back to the beginning of infancy when they didn't know that thing and discover that they learned it by it just being written into them rather than by experiencing it in all of the ways in which they would have. Okay, the advocates of the a priori theory are obliged to have recourse to other arguments. These are reducible to two, which I shall endeavor to state as clearly and as forcibly as possible. So here's the two arguments they might make. In the first place, it is said that if our assent to the proposition that two straight lines cannot enclose a space were derived from the senses, we could only be convinced of its truth by actual trial, that is, by seeing or feeling the straight lines, whereas in fact we see it to be true merely by thinking about it. That a stone thrown into the water goes to the bottom may be perceived by our senses, but mere thinking about a stone thrown into the water would never have led us to that conclusion. Not so, however, with the axioms relating to straight lines. If I could be made to conceive what a straight line is without having seen one, I should at once recognize that two such straight lines cannot enclose a space. Intuition is imaginary looking. He definitely is thinking in the imagination, right? He is advocating that people not use words and be the left side of that diagram and just think in the definitions and call that the concepts. He's imaginarily looking is what he means by his intuition. But experience must be real looking. If we see a property of straight lines to be true by merely fancying ourselves to be looking at them, the ground of our belief cannot be the senses or experiences. It must be something mental. Okay, that's the first argument, that it's a priori, which he disagrees with. To this argument, it might be added to the case of this particular axiom, for the assertion would not be true of all axioms, that the evidence of it from actual ocular inspection is not only unnecessary, but unattainable. What says the axiom? That two straight lines cannot enclose a space? That's not what the axiom says. That after having once intersected, that they are prolonged to infinity, they do not meet again, but continue to diverge from one another? That's not in the definition of a line. How can this, in any single case, be proved by actual observation? We may follow the lines to any distance we please, but we cannot follow them to infinity, for aught our senses can testify. They may, immediately beyond the furthest point to which we have traced them, begin to approach and at last meet, unless, therefore, we had some other proof of the impossibility than observation affords us. We should have no grounds for believing the axiom at all. Wow, that seems to me like a pretty good argument against his position. And he's putting out that as a second argument. He's saying, wait a minute, how could you ever know that two straight lines will never enclose a space through your senses? Because lines are infinitely long. Did you trace all four rays from the point of intersection to infinity and prove that they never meet again? You didn't do that, so you couldn't possibly know it by experience. It must be a priori. To these arguments, which I trust I cannot be accused of understanding, a satisfactory answer will, I conceive, be found if we advert to one of the characteristic properties of geometrical form. Well, you put it pretty well for not understanding the argument. Their capacity of being painted in the imagination with a distinctness equal to reality. In other words, the exact resemblance of our ideas of form to the senses which suggest them. This, in the first place, enables us to make at least, what the heck is he talking about? In other words, the exact resemblance of our ideas of form to the sensations which suggest them. This, in the first place, enables us to make, at least with a little practice, mental pictures of all possible combinations of lines and angles which resemble the realities quite as well as any which we can make on paper, and in the next place, make those pictures just as fit subjects of geometrical experimentation as the realities themselves, inasmuch as pictures, if sufficiently accurate, exhibit, of course, all the properties which would be manifest in the realities at one given instance and on simple inspection. And in geometry, we are concerned only with such properties and not with that which pictures could not exhibit, the mutual action of bodies one upon another. The foundations of geometry would therefore be laid in direct experience, even if the experiments, which in this case consists merely in attentive contemplation, were practiced solely upon what we call our ideas, that is, upon the diagrams in our minds and not upon outward objects. What? Okay, interesting. I never noticed this before. Mill is saying it doesn't count as a priori if I have to experience the ideas. I'm playing with ideas in my brain, and I'm experiencing. So it's a posteriori, it's post experience. I'm looking for Tartaglia to get angry at hearing this. Mill is saying, I believe I've got this correct. He's saying that even if the experiments I'm doing are just in my mind and in my contemplation, how can we say that that's a priori? For in all systems of experimentation, we take some objects to serve as representatives of all which resemble them, and in the present case, the conditions which qualify a real object to be. All right, so look, here's what he's saying. The conception in my mind of a line is a drawing. And if I drew lines on a piece of paper and tried to examine what was true of them, that they can't enclose a space, maybe I could get there, maybe I could abstract, but I'm also just doing a drawing in my mind. And even if that's all I was doing and not actually drawing it out on paper, it's the same thing. For in all systems of experimentation, we take some objects to serve as representations of all which resemble them, and in the present case, the conditions which qualify a real object to be the representative of its class are completely fulfilled by an object existing only in our fancy, without denying, therefore, the possibility of satisfying ourselves that two straight lines cannot enclose a space by merely thinking of straight lines without actually looking at them. I contend that we do not believe this truth on the ground of the imaginary intuition simply, but because we know that the imaginary lines exactly resemble real ones, and that we may conclude from them two real ones with quite as much certainty as we could conclude from one real line to another. The conclusion, therefore, is still an induction from observation, and we should not be authorized to substitute observation of the image in our mind for observation of the reality.
Well,
Okay.
here's what I would say to Mill.
Yeah.
Uh,
If we had not learned. Yeah.
I would say, draw me two lines crossing each other.
You can't. They go on forever. Or just two line segments.
Two line segments. Two
Fine.
line
Okay.
segments crossing.
Sure. He'll do that for you right there. He go boom
Okay.
and boom.
Okay.
Perfect.
And
those are representations.
Then I
Yep.
would say. I would say, do I understand your argument correctly? That you're saying that by looking at those two line segments, I can see that as they go on, as the segments go on beyond themselves, they're getting farther and farther apart.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can see that they're getting farther and farther apart, and they'll never converge on each other in order to enclose space.
Mm-hmm.
I can see that. But then I would say to him, look, you already admitted by a straight line, you already admitted that a straight line is a drawn straight line.
Mm-hmm.
Is a drawn straight line.
How would that work with latitude and longitude going around the Earth, though? Eventually, they would still connect. It would still.
No, we're on a plane. Let's limit it to a plane. Euclidean geometry is Euclidean plane geometry. So,
okay.
So what I'm saying still holds. I would say to him, you admit that your straight line there is the line you drew. Is it possible that your straight edge was a little bit off in real life, and there's a slight curvature to that line? He would have to say yes.
It looks like there is.
In that case, Let's put the curvature in there,
Mhm,
and put the curvature in there.
mhm.
Okay. Okay. Slight curvature. And don't you see that your imagination tells you that it'll cross again if
Sure.
if you keep on going out.
Yep.
It'll cross again. So you would have to conclude that real drawn lines sometimes come back and converge, and sometimes they don't.
I was telling Stephen earlier um, about an art project I had to do in high school where we had to put a point on the piece of paper and then draw geometric lines starting at that point. And we all discovered really quickly that even with using a ruler, you could not draw a perfectly straight line. There was always some kind of wobble curve or something happening, so nobody could actually get it exactly right. And there were so many kids that would get so frustrated because of that. And it's
Yeah, good. That's a good point. That if he wants to make it an empirical matter, he defeats himself. If it's an
It's
empirical
never empirically true. Yeah, that's interesting. Huh.
and I think some of that had to do with, like, I know for me,
Well, wait a minute. Okay, I'm sorry. We have to focus on what the hell Mill is talking about because we got to treat Mill properly here. Remember, he says he's getting his conception of a line from a generalization. So it can be never empirically true. And yet, the few qualities and properties of lines that give us the lineness that is in our definition for our geometric idea could still be generalized out from our experience, he thinks. That's how he would have to deal with your challenge there.
well,
That,
what he's saying,
that's Plato's challenge or
what
Socrates.
he's saying is that our imperfect, we have the ability to uh, change our imperfect drawn line into a perfect line,
Uh-huh.
uh, which seems to me to mean we can switch from an empirical line to a conceptually perfect line. You know, he's right
The fact,
in only one way. He's
uh-huh.
right in mathematicians would never be talking about lines, and triangles and squares if they had not come upon imperfect lines, triangles,
approximations
and
of those
squares.
ideas. Yeah,
Yeah, but
maybe. I mean, Plato doesn't agree with you.
we can talk about
Plato says the mere fact that you could generalize from imperfect lines to an absolute line means that you started out knowing what perfect lines were.
that's Plato.
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's amazing that we actually built anything that's still standing today if lines are such a problem.
Yeah,
You know,
right.
it's kind of the difference between the Great Pyramids and the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Like, somebody got something really, really wrong there.
Funny sketch about that. I can't remember. All right.
That was geologists got that wrong.
Yeah.
They built on what? Shifting mud.
All right, real quickly. All right, so we should not be able to, we should not be authorized to substitute observation of the mind, I'm sorry, of the image in our mind for observation of the reality if we had not learned by long continued experience that the properties of the reality are faithfully represented in the image, just as we should be scientifically warranted in describing an animal which we have never seen from a picture made of it with a how do you say that again? A daguerreotype? I can't remember how to pronounce that word. But not until we had learned by ample experience that observation of such a picture is precisely equivalent to observation of the original. All right, I'm sorry, that ends the section. Um, yeah, I used to be more impressed with Mill. You guys are really hurting my appreciation for Mill. I mean, he wasn't my favorite philosopher here, but there's something wrong with this case that he's making here. I think all three of us are still in the camp of believing in the a priori, the analytic, and maybe even innate ideas.
Well,
So if there's
the dean of philosophers of science, when I was studying, was at Columbia, and his name was Nagel, Ernest Nagel.
Mhm.
And he wrote this book on philosophy of science, and there's a chapter on, he's got a whole chapter on how a priori math affects science and how it can be used. And his claim was, and he's the kind of philosopher that you have to take seriously, even if you disagree with him. His claim was that there's the world of science and math with all their definitions and abstractions, even physics. When physics gives certain laws, it always the laws have to be prefixed by the phrase in a vacuum. So he said the bridge between the real world and the world of math and science has to be bridged, and that's bridged by a discipline of its own, which he called measure theory. Now I never got into measure theory, but he realized there was a huge gulf between the abstract world of math and science and the real world, which somehow had to be bridged in order for the math and science to be helpful in the real world.
What was that theory called again?
He called it measure theory.
Okay.
And you said it was Nagel?
Nagel, Ernest Nagel, but I've never heard that name since. No one to my mind has developed that discipline, which
measure theory,
which would bridge the gap between the abstract and the real world. But he definitely realized that, and he was not so naive as to think that he realized that math and science were the statements of math and science did not apply directly to the real world.
Right. Yeah. Huh. Measure theory. Does measure theory seem like an idea that just didn't get off the ground?
I have no idea. I've never heard the name measure theory again. And
Online, there's a type of thing called a measure theory, but it's in the mathematical context. It attempts to provide a rigorous foundation for integration of probability theory, addressing issues like non-measurable sets and paradoxes that arise in classical calculus. Key concepts include measures, functions that assign non-negative numbers or infinity to nice, quote unquote, nice subsets, sigma algebras. I don't know.
look,
This might be related.
does it have a bibliography at the end of the article?
No. Maybe. Hold on. Let's see. Measure theory is a mathematical framework for defining measures like length or probability on sets, foundational to integration and probability. I asked Grok what Grok thought about it, and they said there's no connection between Nagel and measure theory in the internet.
Who's Grok?
It's an AI,
a
large language model. So let's see, there's some web pages we could look at. An introduction to measure theory basics. It's interesting.
The window. Let me try something.
Well, everybody listening in is going to get to hear about a lot of interesting threads to go and investigate in this class. Just measure theory. The best measure theory books of all time. First look at rigorous probability theory. An introduction to measure theory by Terence Tao, who seems to write a lot on the topic. Your custom tailored book. What? Measure theory, your custom tailored book. I don't know. I would only be speculating, but I wonder.
So
I wonder how you could have such a theory to bridge that gap, because I'm not sure I buy it. What were you going to say, Grace?
I think I understand it, but my brain is like, I'm tired. My brain is tired, so I'm simplifying it way down, like I'm going to explain it to a child.
Go for it. We're like children.
Okay. I think I understand it, and I could be wrong about it, but so let's say you have a plate of cookies, and you want to know how much of the plate is covered by the cookies. So measure theory could help you figure that out. The plate is like a space, a flat area we can measure. The cookies are the set, the things we want to measure, and some parts of the plate have cookies and some don't. So you measure the cookies. The measure theory gives us the rules about how to figure out how much of the plate is covered by the cookies and how much is blank, right?
I'm looking at the Wikipedia article right now, and it sounds like you're pretty much on point. This is all new to me.
Okay.
Yeah. So, that is what it actually looks like. I can share what Wikipedia is talking about, and it looks an awful lot like they're using spatial. Let's see here.
Okay, so my brain is not wanting to actually do the math of it, but so I'm like, I understand the concept, but essentially it's like looking at a big square plate of cookies, and there's only cookies covering like half of it. So the measure theory helps us to say the cookie area is half of the plate area. And then, you can, if you want to do the math of that, you can figure it out.
How does this help us to look at a thermometer and tell something about the world between the concepts of temperature and measure? Like, right? I mean, you're right. That's clearly what this measure theory is about. But the point of measure theory was to help bridge the gap between the concepts in math and science and what's true about the world. I mean, I'm the dumbest person in this room right now, so maybe I just don't see it yet. But it's all probability measure. So we're dealing with area, like you're talking about. I don't know. Is this just a mathematical concept and doesn't have anything to do with Nagel's idea, or
Well, it may be
it
that
could be related?
uh, temperature. What was the example you used?
Julie used cookies on a plate,
No, the one about
the
being a hot.
thermometer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand if Nagel is trying to say we've got to have some way of bridging the gap between our concepts in physics like thermal energy and the actual real world, and we're going to do that with a measure theory. How does all this talk about areas help us to bridge that gap?
Well,
Wouldn't it be how heat distributes and cools over time? Like how lava is super hot and we can kind of measure that, but then when it cools down, it solidifies, becomes a rock we can walk on. It's not dangerous. Wouldn't it be kind of something like that, like being able to measure heat?
The ridiculous philosophical problem here is that somebody is denying that our talk about concepts of thermal energy actually applies to anything about the lava, and somehow measure theory is set up to try to bridge that gap. In other words, the philosopher's not sure that when you measure the lava's temperature, you're actually measuring anything about lava, which is just a weird problem.
That doesn't even that. Okay.
Well, there's reasons. I know that doesn't immediately make sense, but there's reasons why the concepts that we're using are clearly maps. They're approximations of the real world that we're experiencing, and there's this necessary gap. You don't have a map that's one to one of the world, and so your numerical concepts and your physical concepts are sort of always a little bit away from the actual reality, no matter how good they get. And so somehow Nagel wanted to solve this problem by connecting them to with a rope bridge called measure theory. And it's not clear to anybody yet what the heck that's about or how that might work. Okay, let's go into the after conversation and say goodbye to everybody on X, and we'll see you tomorrow, and we'll pick up the classes there. And
okay.